The sun, in its eternal dance across the horizon, cast a warm golden glow over the bustling streets of Chicago. Amidst the cacophony of honking horns and hurried footsteps, the serenity of a small apartment building in Lincoln Park was shattered by the hollow sound of furniture being dragged across the wooden floors. At the center of the turmoil stood Margaret Dawson, a woman of quiet strength, her frame wrapped in a modest floral dress that fluttered softly in the breeze. Her hands trembled as she clutched a photo frame, her eyes locked on a younger version of herself, smiling beside a man whose face time had long since blurred in her memory. This place had been more than a home. It was a sanctuary where her dreams once bloomed like the flowers in her small balcony garden. But now, like those withered blossoms, her life here was being uprooted. Two burly men, their faces hardened by years of labor, moved through the apartment with efficient indifference. Their actions, packing, hauling, dismantling, were mechanical, devoid of any recognition of the life they were disassembling. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice catching like a broken melody. "Could you wait? Just one more day." The taller of the two movers paused only to glance at her, his expression a mixture of pity and irritation. "Sorry, ma'am, but we're just doing our job. Mr. Harrington's orders were clear. The new tenant moves in tomorrow?" Margaret flinched at the mention of the name. Daniel Harrington. His name carried the cold finality of a judge's gavel. Her landlord had been relentless, sending notices she couldn't pay. Then finally, this eviction order. Her pleas for an extension had been met with silence. As the movers continued their work, the door swung open with an air of authority. A man in a tailored olive-green suit entered, his polished leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Daniel Harrington was the epitome of a self-made man, successful, disciplined, and completely detached. His steely gray eyes swept the room, landing on Margaret with a flicker of recognition, then indifference. "I came personally," Daniel announced, his voice as sharp and unyielding as the suit he wore, "because I believe in accountability. You've had 3 months to resolve this issue. Did you think this day wouldn't come?" Margaret turned to face him, the weight of his words pressing down on her like an invisible hand. Her lips parted, but the words she wanted to speak, words of defiance, desperation, even anger, caught in her throat. She straightened her spine as if by sheer will she could push back against the tidal wave of his presence. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "this apartment is not just walls and a roof. It's been my refuge, my garden, my life. And now you take it all without a second thought. How do you sleep at night?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to reply, but then his gaze dropped, catching the curve of her belly. Margaret was pregnant. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut, though his expression betrayed nothing. Time seemed to freeze as the two locked eyes, hers filled with quiet defiance, his with a flicker of something unreadable. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Your personal circumstances are unfortunate," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "But they don't change the fact that you've defaulted on your lease." Margaret stepped forward, her blue dress swaying as she moved. Her hand instinctively cradled her belly. "Do you think a home is just a financial transaction? The walls of this place hold memories, and yet you erase them with a signature and a smirk." Daniel's jaw tightened. He prided himself on being impervious to sentiment, but something in her words lingered, tugging at a corner of his heart he thought he'd sealed off long ago. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "Wherever I must. But don't think for a second that your indifference absolves you. You've taken more than a home from me today. You've stolen my faith in humanity." The room fell into an oppressive silence. Even the movers, who had continued working throughout the exchange, paused momentarily, their heads bowed as if in mourning for something intangible. Daniel ran a hand through his meticulously combed hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic unease. He felt a crack forming in the armor he had spent years building, a chink he wasn't sure he wanted to mend. He turned to Margaret, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I can't undo what's been done," he began, "but perhaps I can offer something else." Margaret raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into every line of her face. "What are you suggesting?" Daniel hesitated, the words foreign to him. "I have another property. It's not grand, but it's safe, quiet. A place where you can rebuild." Margaret studied him, searching for signs of manipulation or pity. She found neither. What she saw instead was a man who, for the first time, seemed unsure of himself. "Why?" she asked, her voice laced with equal parts suspicion and curiosity. "Why would you help me now?" Daniel exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging just slightly. "Sometimes," he said, "when you repair what you've broken, you find pieces of yourself in the process." The offer hung in the air between them, fragile yet undeniable. Margaret, clutching the photo frame tighter, nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice firm but tinged with exhaustion. "I'll accept. But trust, that will take time." Daniel gave a single nod, then turned to the movers. "Pack her things carefully and load them into my car," he instructed. Margaret followed him out of the apartment, her steps tentative but resolute. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows over the city, painting the skyline in hues of amber and crimson. She climbed into the passenger seat of Daniel's sleek black car, her heart a storm of emotions. As they drove through Chicago's winding streets, Margaret stared out the window, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in months, a sliver of hope flickered within her. Daniel, gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual, stole a glance at her from the corner of his eye. For the first time in years, he wondered if the path he had meticulously paved for himself was about to take an unexpected turn, and if, perhaps, that was exactly what he needed. The car slowed to a stop in front of a stately, colonial-style house on the outskirts of the city. Its towering white columns and neatly trimmed hedges exuded an air of timeless elegance, though the surrounding trees and gardens hinted at a touch of wildness that had been allowed to creep in. Margaret stared at the house, her breath catching. It was beautiful, but intimidating, its grandeur a stark contrast to the life she'd been living. "This is the place?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with disbelief. Daniel turned off the ignition and faced her. For the first time since they'd met, his expression held no trace of condescension or authority, only a quiet earnestness. "It's yours for as long as you need," he said simply. Margaret shook her head, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "Mr. Harrington, I don't understand. Why would you—" "Daniel," he interrupted, his tone firm yet gentle. "Please just call me Daniel." He paused, then added, "This isn't charity, Margaret. It's an acknowledgement of a mistake I made, a mistake I'm trying to fix." Margaret searched his face for hidden motives, but found only sincerity. Still, the weight of the offer, of what it might mean to accept, hung heavy on her shoulders. "All right," she said at last, her voice measured. "But this doesn't mean I forgive you." "Not yet." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Daniel's lips. "Fair enough." He stepped out of the car and opened the door for her, a gesture that felt oddly intimate despite its formality. Together they walked up the stone path to the front door. As they approached, the massive wooden door creaked open, revealing an older man in a wheelchair waiting just inside. His sharp eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, bore into them with an intensity that could cut glass. "Arthur," Daniel muttered under his breath. Margaret stiffened, sensing the tension immediately. The older man's voice was gravelly and commanding. "Who is this?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Margaret, as if she were an intruder rather than a guest. Daniel cleared his throat. "Grandfather, This is Margaret Dawson. She'll be staying here for a while." Arthur Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Staying here? In this house? And what, pray tell, gives you the right to make that decision?" Daniel straightened, his tone steady but firm. "It's my decision to make. She needs a place, and I have the means to provide it. That should be reason enough." Arthur scoffed, his disdain palpable. "A bleeding heart doesn't suit you, Daniel. And bringing a stranger into this house in her condition—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. Margaret bristled but kept her composure. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "I may be a stranger to you, but I assure you I didn't ask for this. Your grandson made the offer, and I accepted out of necessity, not comfort." Arthur tilted his head, studying her with newfound curiosity. "You've got spirit," he remarked, though his tone was far from complimentary. "We'll see if that serves you well here." With that, he turned his wheelchair and retreated into the house, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone on the doorstep. "I'm sorry about him," Daniel said, his voice low. "He's complicated." Margaret offered a faint smile. "That's one word for it." Over the following days, Margaret settled into the guest room on the far end of the house. Though it was spacious and comfortable, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place in such a grand setting. She spent most of her time wandering the grounds, avoiding Arthur's watchful gaze and trying to process the whirlwind of recent events. One afternoon, as she explored the sprawling gardens behind the house, she came upon a neglected corner hidden behind a thicket of bushes. There, amidst the overgrown foliage, she found a single rose bush. Its leaves were brittle, its flowers wilted and faded. Yet something about it drew her in, a quiet resilience that mirrored her own. She knelt beside it, her fingers brushing against the dry soil. "You're still holding on," she murmured, as if the plant could hear her. From behind her, a voice spoke. "That one's a lost cause." Margaret turned to see a man in overalls, his hands rough and calloused, standing a few feet away with a pruning tool in hand. "I've tried everything," the gardener continued, shaking his head. "Fertilizer, trimming, watering, you name it. Some plants just don't bounce back." Margaret straightened, her resolve hardening. "Maybe it just needs a different kind of care." The gardener raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "You're welcome to try, but don't get your hopes up." Margaret spent the next several afternoons tending to the rosebush. She watered it diligently, loosened the compacted soil, and cleared away the weeds that choked its roots. She even whispered to it, sharing her hopes and fears as if the plant could somehow absorb her determination. Unbeknownst to her, Arthur watched from his study window. At first, he dismissed her efforts as foolish, but as the days passed, he found himself drawn to the scene, a young woman nurturing something everyone else had given up on. Something about her persistence stirred a memory he couldn't quite place, and though he wouldn't admit it, he felt a glimmer of admiration. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the garden, Arthur wheeled himself out onto the patio. Margaret was already there, kneeling in the dirt, her hands stained from the soil. "You're up early," Arthur remarked, his tone neutral. Margaret looked up, startled, but not flustered. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," Arthur gestured toward the rosebush. "Still trying to save it, I see." Margaret smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Some things are worth the effort, even if the odds aren't in their favor." Arthur studied her for a moment, his expression inscrutable. "We'll see," he said, before turning and wheeling himself back inside. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Arthur surprised everyone by addressing Margaret directly. "I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time in the garden," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold. Margaret nodded, unsure of his intent. "I find it peaceful." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "Peaceful or purposeful?" Margaret met his eyes without hesitation. "Both." For the first time, a hint of a smile played at the corners of Arthur's lips. Daniel, seated beside her, glanced between them, sensing a shift he couldn't quite define. The walls that had always seemed impenetrable around his grandfather were showing the faintest signs of a crack. And at the center of it all was Margaret, a woman who, in her quiet determination, was proving that even the hardest hearts could soften. A week had passed since Margaret arrived, and the house had begun to feel less foreign, though it was far from home. Each day brought new challenges: the cool distance of Arthur Harrington, the subtle scrutiny of the household staff, and the whispers of doubt that plagued her mind. Yet amidst it all, Margaret found solace in her quiet ritual of tending to the neglected rose bush. It was early evening when the equilibrium of the household was disrupted. The family's longtime cook, Mrs. Hargrove, had fallen ill. A fever had left her bedridden, and with an important dinner set to take place that night, a gathering of Arthur's old friend, Henry Whitmore, and his sharp-tongued son, Samuel, there was no one to prepare the meal. "Cancel the dinner," Arthur declared as he wheeled into the kitchen, his voice gruff. "We'll reschedule once Mrs. Hargrove is well." Margaret, who had overheard the commotion, stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. "If you'll allow it, Mr. Harrington, I can prepare the meal." Arthur's piercing gaze landed on her. "You? Cook dinner?" His tone was skeptical, almost dismissive. Margaret straightened her posture. "I'm no chef, but I know my way around a kitchen. If you trust me, I promise I won't disappoint." The room fell silent. Daniel, standing nearby, regarded her with a mix of admiration and concern. Arthur let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said at last, "but if it's inedible, don't expect me to hold back." Margaret smiled faintly. Understood. With a calm determination, she rolled up her sleeves and set to work. The pantry held a modest assortment of ingredients, but Margaret's resourcefulness turned limitations into opportunities. She crafted a menu that was simple yet elegant: roasted chicken with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, and a fresh spring salad. For dessert she prepared a rustic apple tart, its golden crust glistening with a hint of caramelized sugar. As the clock ticked closer to dinner, Margaret felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her. This meal was more than just food. It was a statement, a chance to prove her worth in a household where she was still an outsider. When the dishes were finally ready, she carefully plated each one, her hands steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. Pushing the serving cart toward the dining room, she took a deep breath, bracing herself for what lay ahead. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his expression stoic as Margaret entered with the cart. Daniel rose instinctively to help her, but she waved him off with a polite shake of her head. "I've got it," she said softly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of resolve. One by one, she placed the plates before the guests. Henry Whitmore raised an eyebrow. As the aroma wafted toward him, his curiosity piqued. His son, Samuel, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on Margaret with thinly veiled amusement. Arthur cut into the chicken with deliberate precision, his fork hovering as he brought the first bite to his mouth. The room seemed to hold its breath. After a long moment he nodded, just barely, but it was enough. "This will do," he said gruffly, though a flicker of approval crossed his face. Henry, less reserved, broke into a wide smile. "More than do, Arthur. This is excellent. Who prepared it?" Before Arthur could answer, Margaret stepped forward. "That would be me, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. Henry's smile widened. "Well, Miss?" "Margaret Dawson," she supplied. "Well, Miss Dawson, you've done a fine job. It's rare to find someone with such a touch for flavor. My compliments." Samuel, however, seemed less impressed. "A tenant turned cook?" he quipped, his tone laced with condescension. "Quite the career pivot." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "Life often demands we adapt, Mr. Whitmore. Perhaps you've been fortunate enough not to face such challenges." The subtle rebuke hung in the air, and Samuel's smirk faltered, Daniel, watching from across the table, hid a smile behind his glass of water. Arthur cleared his throat, drawing the attention back to him. "Miss Dawson has shown initiative, which is more than I can say for most." His eyes flicked toward Samuel, who quickly busied himself with his plate. After the meal, as the guests retired to the parlor for drinks, Margaret lingered in the kitchen, tidying up. Daniel found her there, his tie loosened, and a warm smile on his face. "You were incredible tonight," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Margaret glanced at him, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I just wanted to help." "You did more than that. My grandfather doesn't give compliments lightly, and Henry Whitmore practically sang your praises. You've earned their respect, Margaret." She hesitated, her hands stilling over the sink. Respect is one thing, acceptance is another. Daniel stepped closer, his expression softening. "It'll come. You've already proven you belong here, whether they realize it or not." Margaret offered him a small smile, gratitude flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." The moment hung between them, quiet and unspoken, before Margaret turned back to her work. Late that night, Arthur sat alone in the study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He stared out the window at the moonlit garden, his mind turning over the events of the evening. For all his gruffness, he couldn't deny that Margaret had surprised him. There was a strength to her, an unwavering determination that reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. Setting his glass down, he leaned back in his chair, a rare sense of unease settling over him. For the first time in years, Arthur Harrington felt the faint stirrings of something he'd thought long buried, hope. Margaret Dawson, with her quiet resilience, was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret's presence in the Harrington household continued to ripple through its carefully maintained routines. Though Arthur still maintained a measured distance, his icy demeanor had begun to thaw in small, almost imperceptible ways. His glances were less cutting, his remarks slightly less sharp. For Margaret, these small shifts were victories, each one a step closer to bridging the chasm of mistrust between them. One morning, as Margaret tended to the rosebush, she noticed something extraordinary. A single, vibrant bud had emerged. Its crimson petals, dewy and delicate, were a stark contrast to the withered branches around it. She smiled, her heart lifting. The plant wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Unbeknownst to her, Arthur was watching from the patio. "You've brought that thing back to life," he remarked, wheeling closer. Margaret turned, startled but pleased by his presence. "I didn't bring it back. It just needed the right conditions to heal itself." Arthur tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Do you believe everything can be healed?" She hesitated, sensing the weight behind the question. "I believe most things can, but it takes time and effort." Arthur let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Time isn't always on our side." Margaret looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Arthur nodded slightly, his gaze lingering on the rose bush. "Perhaps." As weeks turned into months, the dynamics of the household shifted further. Margaret's quiet perseverance and natural warmth began to soften even the most skeptical members of the staff. The gardener often joined her in the afternoons, sharing tips and stories about the estate's history. The housekeeper, once curt and formal, started leaving small bouquets of fresh flowers in Margaret's room, a silent gesture of acceptance. But it was Daniel who seemed most affected by her presence. He found himself seeking her out more often, under the guise of checking on her well-being. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. The lines between obligation and genuine connection blurred until Daniel could no longer distinguish them. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens, he finally broke the silence. "Margaret, I need to ask you something." She glanced at him, her expression open but cautious. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Do you regret coming here, accepting my offer?" Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him fully. At first I did. I felt out of place, like I didn't belong, but now— She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the house. Now I think this is where I'm supposed to be, at least for now. Her words stirred something in Daniel, though he wasn't sure he could name it. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet. For what? For proving me wrong. About people. About myself. Margaret met his eyes, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Maybe it's not about being wrong or right. Maybe it's just about learning. Daniel nodded, his admiration for her growing with each passing day. Inside the house, Arthur observed the pair from his study window, his fingers steepled as he leaned back in his chair. He watched the way Daniel's expression softened when he looked at Margaret, the way her laughter seemed to draw him in like a magnet. "You're playing with fire, boy," Arthur muttered under his breath. But as much as he wanted to dismiss it, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if Margaret was exactly what this fractured family needed. A spark of life in a house weighed down by years of unspoken grief and rigid expectations. For the first time in decades, Arthur found himself reconsidering the rigid rules that had governed his life. Perhaps, he thought, some rules were meant to be broken. Daisy took a deep breath before speaking, fully aware of the impact her words would carry. Life, Mr. Evans, is seldom fair or easy, but I've learned that our challenges are what shape us. It's in the deepest shadows that our true strength reveals itself. Her voice was calm, but her tone carried the weight of her own experiences. We've all faced hardships, some more visible than others. Like you, I've been scarred, but those marks don't define us. What matters is how we rise from them. And you, sir, have transformed your challenges into an admirable strength. A profound silence followed, heavy with meaning. Something in Daisy's words unsettled Frederick, stirring a quiet respect he hadn't expected to feel. He studied her for a long moment, his sharp gaze softening. Arthur, seated beside Daisy, looked at her with astonishment and a newfound admiration. Eric, sensing the tension in the room, raised his glass with a smile. "I must say, Arthur, your guest has more wisdom in one sentence than most of us gather in a lifetime. I'll drink to that." Santiago, who had been quietly observing, shifted uncomfortably. His expression, once laced with skepticism, now mirrored genuine admiration. "It seems appearances can be deceiving," he said, his tone more subdued, as he glanced at Arthur. "I understand now why you've made her your guest of honor." Arthur, catching the insinuation in Santiago's comment, responded by subtly taking Daisy's hand under the table. He smiled warmly, but refrained from speaking, knowing the moment was better, left uninterrupted. Frederick, breaking the silence, leaned forward slightly. "Arthur," he began, his voice grave, but with an undertone of reluctant approval, "it's clear this young woman has brought something different to this house, and though I won't admit it easily, I believe she's earned her place at this table tonight." Arthur's eyes brightened, recognizing the significance of his grandfather's gesture. It was the closest thing to acceptance Frederick had ever expressed. Daisy, though outwardly composed, felt a sense of triumph. She hadn't just gained a seat at the table, she had earned the respect of one of the most difficult men to impress. Meanwhile, in the garden, a transformation was quietly taking place. The once wilted rose in the forgotten corner had begun to bloom, its vibrant petals mirroring the renewal unfolding within the Evans mansion. The following morning, sunlight filtered gently through the mansion's heavy curtains, casting a golden glow on the quiet halls. The air felt lighter, as if the household had taken a collective breath after days of tension. Frederick had been uncharacteristically reserved, spending much of the past 48 hours in his office or gazing out at the garden. Daisy, meanwhile, continued with her routine, tending to the rose, assisting the household staff, and keeping herself busy in an environment that still felt unfamiliar. That morning, as Arthur worked in the library, Frederick ventured into the garden, Daisy, pruning plants nearby, noticed him moving slowly in his wheelchair. Something seemed off. Frederick hesitated, clutching his chest. His face contorted with pain, and before he could call out, his body slumped forward slightly in the chair. "Frederick!" Daisy whispered in alarm, dropping her tools and rushing toward him. Her heart pounded as she reached his side. The old man was conscious, but pale. His breathing labored. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead, and his lips tightened in a grimace. "Arthur!" Daisy yelled toward the house, her voice filled with urgency. "Arthur, call an ambulance!" But Arthur was too far away to hear. Daisy realized she couldn't afford to wait. She knelt beside Frederick, placing one hand on his shoulder and the other on his neck to check his pulse. It was weak and irregular. "Mr. Evans, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the panic rising in her chest. "I need you to focus on my voice. Inhale slowly through your nose and exhale through your mouth." Frederick tried to follow her instructions, but the pain was overwhelming. Daisy recognized the symptoms immediately: a heart attack. Her father, a retired paramedic, had taught her basic first aid when she was younger, lessons she now drew upon with precision. Acting quickly, she loosened Frederick's tie and unbuttoned the top of his shirt to help him breathe. "You'll get through this," she assured him, her tone calm but firm. "I'm here with you." At that moment, Arthur appeared in the doorway, his face stricken with fear as he took in the scene. "Arthur!" Daisy called, her voice commanding. "Call 911 now. Tell them we have a suspected heart attack." Arthur fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he made the call. Meanwhile, Daisy kept Frederick upright in his chair, ensuring he remained slightly tilted forward to aid his breathing. "Stay with me, Mr. Evans," she urged. "Keep your eyes on me. Breathe slowly." Frederick's face twisted in pain, but something about Daisy's steady presence seemed to anchor him. He focused on her voice, even as his body struggled. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours until the faint sound of sirens filled the air. "They're here!" Arthur shouted, relief breaking through his panic. Daisy didn't let her focus waver. She gently massaged Frederick's chest, a technique her father had taught her to stimulate blood flow and reduce anxiety during heart attacks. "You're strong, Mr. Evans," she whispered. "Remember, no matter how dark things seem, there's always a spark of light to guide us. We'll get through this together." The paramedics arrived, rushing toward Frederick with practiced efficiency. Daisy quickly relayed the details of what had happened, explaining the measures she had taken to stabilize him. "You did everything right," one of the paramedics said, nodding in approval as they transferred Frederick onto a stretcher. "You've given him the best chance possible." Arthur turned to Daisy, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. You saved his life." Daisy, her adrenaline beginning to subside, met Arthur's gaze. "I did what anyone would have done," she said softly. "My father always told me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it." As the ambulance pulled away, carrying Frederick to the hospital, Arthur stood beside Daisy, his expression filled with a newfound respect and gratitude. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. In that moment, both of them knew that the events of the day had irrevocably changed the course of their lives, and the Evans mansion would never be the same again. The hospital, though bustling with activity, seemed eerily quiet as Daisy and Arthur sat in the waiting room. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression calm but serious. "Mr. Evans has undergone a successful procedure to clear the coronary blockage," the doctor said. "He's stable now and recovering in a private room. You can see him, but keep the visit brief. He needs rest." Relief washed over both Daisy and Arthur as they followed the doctor to Frederick's room. The sight of him lying pale and frail in the hospital bed sent a pang of worry through Arthur's chest. But there was something different in Frederick's expression, a softness that neither of them had seen before. "Arthur, Daisy," Frederick said weakly, his voice trembling with emotion, Thank you for coming. There's something I need to say, something I can't put off any longer." He took a deep breath, gathering his strength, and turned his gaze to Daisy. His sharp, commanding eyes, once filled with judgment, now shimmered with humility and regret. "Daisy," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly. I treated you with disdain and dismissed your worth without a second thought. I thought power and control were the only ways to command respect, but I see now how wrong I was. When I was at my weakest, you didn't hesitate. You didn't see a cruel old man. You saw a human being in need of help, and you saved me." Arthur, standing beside Daisy, blinked back tears. He had never seen his grandfather so vulnerable, so open. Frederick's voice faltered, but he pushed on. "You've taught me something I never thought I'd learn at my age, that true greatness lies in compassion, that strength isn't about power, but about how we care for others. I ask for your forgiveness, not out of pride, but from the depths of my heart." Daisy, her own eyes brimming with tears, stepped closer and took Frederick's hand in hers. "Mr. Evans," she said gently, her voice warm but steady, "forgiveness isn't what matters most. It's what we learn from our struggles that shapes us. You've shown more strength in admitting your mistakes than most people ever will. Of course, I forgive you." Frederick's lips trembled as he nodded, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Daisy. You've brought light to this family in ways I could never have imagined." Arthur, unable to contain his emotions, knelt beside the bed and took his grandfather's other hand. "Grandfather," he said, his voice cracking, "I thought the distance between us could never be bridged, but seeing how you've opened your heart, it means more to me than anything. Daisy has shown us what it means to truly be a family." Frederick nodded slowly, his tears flowing freely. "Perhaps," he said with a broken voice, "there's still hope for an old fool like me." Daisy smiled through her tears. "There's always hope, Mr. Evans. Hope is like the rose I've been tending. It may wither, but with care and patience, it can bloom again." In that quiet room, the three of them shared a moment of profound connection. The silence that followed wasn't heavy with tension, but filled with relief and understanding. Outside, the sun shone brightly, its rays streaming through the hospital window as if nature itself celebrated this fragile but beautiful moment of healing. Back at the Evans mansion, life began to shift. The once imposing and cold atmosphere softened into something warmer, more inviting. Frederick, now home and recovering, spent more time in the garden, often watching Daisy tend to the rose bush that had become a symbol of the family's transformation. Arthur and Daisy's relationship grew stronger with each passing day. Daisy, now in her 9th month of pregnancy, had become an integral part of the family and the Evans real estate business. Her keen insights and compassionate approach helped Arthur modernize the company, launching initiatives to support single mothers and underprivileged families. "You're a natural," Arthur told her one evening as they worked side by side in his study. "I can't imagine running this company without you." Daisy smiled, her hand resting on her belly. "It's not just us anymore, Arthur. Everything we do is for him and for the family we're building together." One morning, while Frederick enjoyed the garden's serenity, a knock at the mansion's door brought an unwelcome surprise. A housemaid approached Daisy, who was helping Arthur with paperwork in the library. "Miss Daisy," the maid said hesitantly, "there's a man in the living room asking for you." Daisy's heart sank. She carefully set down her pen and followed the maid, her hand protectively cradling her belly. When she entered the living room, she froze. Standing there, with a smug smile and a predatory gleam in his eyes, was Elvis, the father of her child. "You?" Daisy murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as her breath caught in her chest. All the color drained from her face. "What are you doing here?" Elvis stood in the center of the room, his posture casual, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He wore a simple outfit, faded jeans and a plain shirt, but his smirk carried an arrogance that made the air in the room feel suffocating. "Not even a hello?" he asked, tilting his head mockingly. "You've been busy, haven't you, Daisy? It wasn't hard to find you, you know. Your benefactor is quite the public figure, and when I saw your picture alongside him on social media..." He trailed off with a sarcastic chuckle. "I couldn't believe it, so I thought I'd come see for myself." Daisy closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to remain calm. She drew a deep breath and lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "What do you want, Elvis?" she asked evenly. "There's nothing here for you. I suggest you leave." Elvis barked out a laugh, taking a step toward her. "What do I want, Daisy? Isn't it obvious? I want you, and my son." His tone darkened, the smile fading from his face. "I'm here to claim what's mine." Daisy felt her instincts urging her to step back, but she stood her ground. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, and her voice, though calm, carried a steely edge. "I am not a possession, and neither is my child. Love isn't about control or claims, Elvis. It's about care and respect. Two things you've never understood." Elvis's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he growled, taking another step closer. "Yes, I can," Daisy replied, her voice unwavering, "because I've learned to respect myself, something you never did. I don't need your permission to live my life or raise my son, and I certainly won't let him grow up in the shadow of your selfishness and control." Elvis clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. His voice dropped to a low snarl. "You've always been full of yourself, haven't you, Daisy? Do you think you can just erase me from this picture?" Before Daisy could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Daisy, are you all right? Who is this man?" Arthur's voice was firm, and as he stepped into the room, his eyes locked onto Elvis with clear distrust. Daisy turned toward Arthur, relief flashing across her face. But Elvis, undeterred, straightened his posture and turned to face him. "Elvis Ward," he announced with mock politeness. "Father of the child your guest is carrying. I came to take what's mine." Arthur's jaw tightened and his eyes darkened. "You have no right to anything here," he said, taking a step forward, "and I suggest you leave before I call security." Elvis laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, of course, because a rich man's threats mean so much to me," he sneered. "But let's get one thing straight. I'm not going anywhere. Daisy and I have a bond you can't break. She's the mother of my child, and that means she's mine." Arthur's fury boiled over, but he kept his composure. "You have no idea what love or respect means," he said coldly. "You see people as tools, things to use and discard. That's not love. It's possession, and I won't let you hurt her or this child." Elvis's face twisted with anger, his tone growing more aggressive. "You think you can take what's mine?" he spat. "Daisy belongs with me, and nothing you say can change that." Before the situation could escalate further, a commanding voice echoed from the doorway. "What is going on here?" All heads turned to see Frederick entering the room in his wheelchair, his face stern and his voice steady, despite his recent health scare. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, locking onto Elvis. "Just a friendly little chat," Elvis said smoothly, though his tone was laced with malice. "I was reminding your grandson that Daisy is mine. She's carrying my child, after all." Frederick's eyes narrowed as he wheeled himself closer. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "But if you're not here to contribute something constructive, I suggest you leave before you regret stepping foot in this house." Elvis's confidence faltered under Frederick's icy glare, but he quickly recovered. "You think you can intimidate me?" he scoffed. "This isn't over. Daisy knows she belongs with me." Daisy, overwhelmed by the escalating confrontation, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her mind raced as a desperate thought took shape. "Frederick, Arthur," she began, her voice trembling, "maybe it's best if I go with him." The room fell silent. Frederick's face paled, and Arthur's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" Arthur said, his voice laced with shock and pain. Daisy fought back tears as she spoke. "I don't want this to harm your health, Frederick, and if leaving will end this chaos, then, I'll do it." Her words shattered the air like glass. Arthur stared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "No," Arthur said firmly, stepping toward her. "You don't have to do this, Daisy. He has no power here." Daisy turned to face Arthur, her tears threatening to spill. "Arthur, this isn't just about me. I can't let this escalate any further, not when it could affect your grandfather's health." Her voice wavered, but her resolve remained firm. Arthur stepped closer, his voice soft yet determined. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself for us, Daisy. We're in this together, and I won't let him manipulate you." Frederick, who had been watching in silence, cleared his throat, his voice steady despite his weakened state. "Daisy, don't you dare let this man intimidate you into making a decision out of fear. You owe him nothing." Elvis sneered, his composure slipping as the room turned against him. "That's rich, coming from the man who didn't even know Daisy existed until a few months ago," he spat. "I'm the father of her child, and whether you like it or not, that gives me rights." Frederick's eyes blazed with an intensity that silenced Elvis momentarily. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," Frederick said, his voice cold and authoritative. "That child is my great-grandson, a legitimate Evans. He is the result of Daisy's love for Arthur, a relationship I have witnessed with my own eyes. You, on the other hand, have done nothing to deserve any place in this family." Elvis faltered, his face a mix of confusion and anger. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. Arthur took a step forward, standing tall and calm despite the chaos. "You heard him," Arthur said. "This child is mine. Daisy and I have been together for over a year, and there's no room for you in her life, or our family." Daisy's eyes widened in surprise as Arthur continued, his voice steady. "You came here thinking you could bully her into submission," Arthur said, his tone hardening. "But all you've done is prove how unworthy you are. Leave now, or I'll have security escort you out." Elvis glared at Arthur, his fists clenched. "So that's your story? That this kid is yours?" He barked out a bitter laugh. "What a convenient little lie." "It's no lie," Frederick interjected, his voice sharp. "And I suggest you think carefully about your next move, Mr. Ward. You've already shown your true colors. Do you really want to dig yourself a deeper hole?" Elvis opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Daisy suddenly gasped, clutching her belly. A sharp pain coursed through her, and a small cry escaped her lips. "Arthur!" she called out, her voice tight with panic. Arthur rushed to her side, steadying her as she leaned into him. "What's wrong?" he asked, his face pale with worry. Daisy's breathing grew labored as another wave of pain hit her. "My water just broke," she whispered, her voice trembling. Elvis took a step back, his face pale as realization dawned on him. I'm not dealing with this," he muttered, his bravado crumbling. Before anyone could respond, Elvis turned and stormed out of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The room felt lighter the moment he disappeared, but there was no time to celebrate. Arthur gently lifted Daisy into his arms. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly. Frederick, still seated in his wheelchair, nodded. "Go," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Take care of her and my great-grandson." Arthur carried Daisy to the car, his heart racing as he drove through the streets. Traffic seemed to part in their favor, and they arrived at the hospital in record time. In the delivery room, Daisy gripped Arthur's hand tightly as the pain of labor racked her body. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, but Arthur stayed by her side, whispering words of encouragement. "You're so strong, Daisy," he murmured. "I'm right here. We're doing this together." Her determination carried her through the hours that followed, and finally the room was filled with the soft cry of a newborn. Tears streamed down Daisy's face as the doctor placed her son in her arms. "He's perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Arthur leaned down, kissing Daisy's forehead and then gazing at the tiny baby with awe. "He's beautiful," Arthur said, his voice trembling, just like his mother. A few hours later, Frederick arrived at the hospital, wheeled to the observation room by a nurse. He gazed at his great-grandson through the glass, his eyes brimming with pride. "So small," he murmured to himself, "and yet he carries so much hope." The nurse smiled. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. Frederick hesitated for a moment before nodding. Moments later, he cradled the baby in his arms, tears spilling freely down his cheeks. "You're going to do great things," he whispered. "You're going to make this family proud." Back in Daisy's hospital room, Arthur entered, carrying the baby, carefully wrapped in a soft blue blanket. He placed him gently in Daisy's arms, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "I never thought I could feel this much love," Arthur said quietly, his gaze locked on Daisy and their son. Daisy smiled, her exhaustion eclipsed by the overwhelming joy in her heart. "Neither did I," she admitted. Arthur reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple but elegant engagement ring. "Daisy," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "you've given me more than I ever thought I deserved. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Daisy's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, I'll marry you." Arthur slipped the ring onto her finger, and they leaned into each other, sealing the moment with a tender kiss. The Evans mansion had never looked more radiant than on Daisy and Arthur's wedding day. The gardens bloomed in vibrant colors. The air was filled with the delicate scent of roses, and strings of golden lights twinkled like stars in the early evening. The once cold and imposing estate now felt alive, echoing with the laughter and joy of family and friends who had gathered to celebrate a new beginning. Daisy stood before a tall mirror in her bridal suite, her white gown flowing gracefully around her. The dress was simple yet elegant, its soft fabric adorned with subtle floral embroidery. Her hair was swept into a loose updo, and her veil cascaded down her back like a whisper of light. In her arms she cradled her baby boy, Christopher, who cooed softly, his tiny hand clutching the delicate lace of her dress. "You're going to be such a handsome little man today," she said, kissing his forehead. "And I'm the luckiest woman in the world to have you and your father." There was a gentle knock at the door, and when Daisy turned, she saw Frederick in his wheelchair, a bouquet of white roses resting in his lap. His face was lit with a mixture of pride and emotion. "You look breathtaking," he said, his voice wavering. "Thank you," Daisy replied softly, walking toward him. Frederick gestured for her to take the flowers, which she accepted with a warm smile. "These are for you," he said. "But they're also a symbol of everything you've brought to this family. You've given us a second chance, Daisy, a chance to be better." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she knelt beside him. "And you've shown me the meaning of forgiveness and redemption, Mr. Evans. I'll always cherish that." Frederick took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You've given me a reason to keep fighting, to keep living. Thank you for that." Daisy leaned in and kissed his cheek. "You're part of this family's heart, Frederick. I hope you know that." The ceremony took place in the garden, beneath a canopy of twinkling lights and blooming flowers. Arthur stood at the altar, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, but his calm demeanor faltered the moment he saw Daisy step into view. She walked slowly, her arm linked with Frederick's, as he wheeled himself beside her, leading her down the aisle. All eyes were on her, but Arthur saw only Daisy, the woman who had transformed his life, who had given him love, a child, and a future he never thought possible. When they reached the altar, Frederick passed Daisy's hand to Arthur, his own trembling slightly as he did so. "Take care of her," he said simply, his voice gruff with emotion. Arthur nodded. "I will," he promised. The vows they exchanged were simple but heartfelt, their words filled with a love that had grown stronger through the trials they had faced together. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Arthur leaned forward, cupping Daisy's face in his hands as he kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. The celebration that followed was filled with music, laughter, and joy. Christopher, dressed in a tiny suit that matched his father's, was passed from guest to guest, his giggles lighting up the room. Frederick, though still recovering, stayed late into the evening, watching from his wheelchair as the family he had once ruled with cold authority danced and laughed together in a way he had never imagined. As the night wound down, Arthur and Daisy slipped away from the crowd, walking hand in hand through the quiet garden. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the rosebush Daisy had nurtured, now fully in bloom. Arthur stopped and turned to face her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "This garden, this mansion, this family. It's all because of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Daisy smiled, her heart full. "We did this together, Arthur. You, me, Christopher, and Frederick. We're a team, and that's what makes it so special." He kissed her softly, then pulled her into a warm embrace. For a moment they stood in silence, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the life they had built together. From the mansion, Frederick watched them through the window, a satisfied smile on his face. He had lived long enough to see his family transformed, not by wealth or power, but by love, forgiveness, and hope. Months later, the Evans mansion continued to thrive with life. Daisy and Arthur's initiatives at the company had helped countless families, and the estate itself had become a haven of warmth and community. Frederick spent most of his days in the garden, watching Christopher play among the flowers. The once withered rosebush had become a symbol of renewal, its vibrant blooms standing as a testament to the strength of love and perseverance. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Frederick raised his glass. "To Daisy," he said, his voice strong despite his age, "you've shown us all what it means to live with compassion, courage, and love. You've made this family whole again." Daisy blushed as Arthur took her hand, squeezing it gently. Christopher, now a curious toddler, giggled from his high chair, his laughter filling the room with joy. The Evans family had found their way through the darkness and into the light, and their story was far from over. As they sat together that evening, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with love as their foundation and hope as their guide. And outside, in the moonlit garden, the roses continued to bloom. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Leave your name in the comments for a special shout-out, and stay tuned for more stories of hope, love, and resilience.